it's easier to spot geopolitical incompetence than to spot geopolitical competence, And of course, whenever there's geopolitical incompetence, there is wars, And I believe that every war we see today reflects geopolitical incompetence. The Europeans thought they had won the Cold War, so they became very arrogant. They saw no reason for compromise with anybody. We have won, we are the top dogs. We decide, you accept what we are today. And that arrogance clearly leads to geopolitical incompetence. Whereas humility, by the way, is a very good quality to have in geopolitics.
我们刚刚看到的是2025年10月，新加坡著名思想家马凯硕在一场访谈中的片段。在访谈中，他带领我们进行了一次环球旅行，系统性地审视了当今世界各大区域组织的现状，并提出了一个引人深思的观察：从南亚到中东，从非洲到欧洲，为何冲突和僵局随处可见？在接下来的内容中，我们将深入聆听马凯硕先生对这一全球性难题的深刻剖析。他将用一个堪称教科书级的经典案例，向我们揭示什么是真正的地缘政治能力，而一度被视为成功典范的欧洲，又是如何因其地缘政治无能，亲手点燃了自己家门口的战火。这不仅是一次对全球乱局的诊断，更是一次对东西方不同政治智慧的深刻洞察。让我们继续。
What I want to talk about is something that should be seen to be a genuine mystery. And this genuine mystery, which I must confess to you I haven't completely solved, is why is Southeast Asia at peace? Because going by all the logic of either past history or watching trends around the world, the peace that we see today in Southeast Asia is not normal. It's abnormal. And I'll explain why it's abnormal. And because it is so abnormal, I'm surprised that not more people are noticing it. Of course, we've had skirmishes here and there between the two ASEAN member states, like recently between Thailand and Cambodia. But we have nothing like the kind of major wars you see happening in Ukraine or the major wars you see happening, as you can see in Gaza today, right? So the reason why I say it's a mystery is because firstly, if you look at all the regions in the world, the one region that should be programmed for war rather than programmed for peace should be Southeast Asia. Because it's important for us to be aware that no other region on planet Earth is as diverse as Southeast Asia is, right? I mean, the one statistic I give is that out of the 700 million people in Southeast Asia, you have now more than 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and as you know, we have lots of communists also in Southeast Asia. And amazingly, given this tremendous diversity, this is why all the previous British historians, when they wrote about Southeast Asia, described Southeast Asia as the Balkans of Asia. And this, as you know, in the Balkans of Europe is where you saw all the struggles and fights and all that. They thought, well, Southeast Asia is going to be where all the wars will take place. So for a region that should have been a natural cauldron for war, right? To have become instead one of the most peaceful regions and prosperous regions on planet Earth is abnormal. It shouldn't have happened. And so we should therefore begin to try and understand how is it we arrive at this very strange, abnormal situation that we have. So as I said, the first reason is that we were designed to be as a diverse place, a place where you should see more conflicts, tensions, and so on and so forth. But we haven't seen that. And secondly, the reason why this peace is abnormal is because if you look at, for example, you should compare ASEAN or Southeast Asia to the regions in the global south, to the developing countries regions. And I'm going to take you on a tour of the world, and I'll show you how ASEAN, in comparison with every other region, is doing. Now, of course, our most immediate neighborhood in some ways is South Asia, right? And you have India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, right? And they have a regional organization called the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. Now, that region actually should find it easier to cooperate or have peace with each other because, frankly, they share a common history. And even though there's divisions between Hindus and Muslims, and as you see between India and Pakistan, the people speak the same language, eat the same food. And I can tell you, when I was serving as Singapore's ambassador in New York over 10 years, and I would meet all the bankers from Citibank and other places, and I would watch these Indians and Pakistanis talking to each other, singing the same songs, eating the same food, and I couldn't tell who's Indian, who's Pakistani, They look very similar, right? So they were so similar, and yet despite that, as you can see, in South Asia, you've had significant conflicts. In fact, one that took place very recently on a much larger scale than anything you see in Southeast Asia. And at the same time, the leaders of that South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation haven't even met each other for several years. They can't talk to each other. I mean, forget trying to make peace. They can't even talk to each other. That's the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. And of course, if you go to the Middle East, as you know, the Middle East is a really troubled place. And just when you think things may settle down, some new surprises come up there. And I can tell you, for example, the Israeli bombing of Qatar should come as a big shock to us. Because frankly, Qatar is a peaceful, sovereign country that was actually trying to bring peace between the Israelis and Palestinians, and actually at the request of the Americans too. But then out of the blue, they get bombed, right? Now, as you know, you all sitting in this room, not worrying for 1 second whether or not a bomb will come and land somewhere near you, right? You take it for granted. The people in Doha took it for granted too. Guess what? The bombs came. So again, it shows you how abnormal the peace we have over here. And of course, if you go to the continent of Africa, as you know, there are a tremendous number of conflicts here and there of different scales, and some are incredibly brutal. Thousands have lost their lives, like in Sudan, for example. Tremendously painful wars have taken place in Africa. And what's interesting is that when you cross the Atlantic Ocean, when you go to South America, the good news about South America is that the states don't go to war with each other. There's been no major war between Brazil and Argentina, or Brazil and its neighbors, and so on and so forth. So by and large, South America is at peace. But even though most of them share the same language, most of them speak Spanish except for Brazil that speaks Portuguese, and despite the fact they come from a common European traditions and they should have learned from the example of Europe, even there regional cooperation is difficult, and the leaders of Brazil and Argentina haven't met for some years again. Again, they don't talk to each other. See? They're very similar, but they don't talk to each other. And in Southeast Asia, we have no difficulty talking to each other. So if you compare Southeast Asia region by region by region, it's amazing that we are by far the most peaceful and prosperous corner of the global south, right? And then what's interesting is that even if you compare ASEAN, let's say with in theory the most successful regional organization, which is the European Union. Now it's true that within the European Union, there have been no wars fought among any two EU member states. And that's a great achievement on the part of the European Union. And I consider this the greatest civilizational achievement of any regional organization, because in the European Union, you don't just have zero wars with each other, you have zero prospect of war. Now, we in ASEAN, we have not achieved zero prospect of war yet, as you can see within Thailand and Cambodia, the skirmishes there. But what's interesting is that even though in theory the European Union is ahead of ASEAN, actually the story is more complicated. Because even though the Europeans have not fought wars with each other directly, they have fought proxy wars. And I can tell you that one reason why Yugoslavia fell apart in the 1990s was because different European countries supported different parts of Yugoslavia. And so that war was in one way a result of European Machiavellian manipulations that also happened, right? And what's interesting is that even though the European Union is supposed to be a beacon of peace, the major wars that we have seen since the end of the Cold War in 1990 have been in and around Europe. And I can tell you that, for example, the European Union, the current war in Ukraine could have been avoided if the European Union had shown some degree of geopolitical competence in managing its neighbors like Russia. Now, there's nothing that I say justifies the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal. It violates international law. That's very clear. But it's a war that could have been avoided that if there had been more geopolitical competence. And this is, again, surprising that ASEAN is a region of developing countries, not developed countries. The Europeans have much bigger budgets, much more sophisticated foreign ministries, but they failed to achieve peace in the region. We, with much less geopolitical, much less sophisticated institutions, have created peace in our region, you know. So I hope by now I may give you a sense of why it is so unusual to have such peace and prosperity in Southeast Asia. But I have not yet been able to figure out why this has happened. Why are we peaceful? But if you ask me to look for a theory, I would say it has to do possibly with the character and soul of the largest member country within ASEAN. Now, why does the largest member country matter? I can tell you that most regional organizations fail because the biggest country in the region tries to dominate the organization. And for example, if you talk to in South Asia, sometimes the neighbors of India complain, well, India is too big, is trying to control the organization. If you go to the Pacific Forum, I can tell you, when I was ambassador to the UN, the Pacific Forum ambassadors would tell me privately, saying Australia is so big, Australia is trying to bully the small countries in the Pacific Forum. And certainly the Organization of American States is dysfunctional because the United States is so strong. It controls and manipulates the organization. So if the big country tries to control or dominate the region, then it becomes dysfunctional. So what's interesting is that Indonesia has decided not to do that, which is unusual. And the question is, why not? You know? And here I must say, and I reflect on the fact that I first attended ASEAN meetings in 1971. That's about 55 54 years ago. And I can tell you, when I attended the ASEAN meetings at that time, there was a tremendous amount of distrust among all the ASEAN countries. It's quite natural because, Malaysia and Singapore had just separated. Indonesia just had confrontation against Malaysia. Philippines was claiming a state of Malaysia. And then, Thailand had some problems with Malaysia over separatists in southern Thailand. So you had all kinds of problems within the region. And there was a lot of suspicion. So how do we overcome that suspicion and rivalry? And when I look back at it, I realized that actually the Indonesian diplomats, in a very sort of understated fashion, tried to get everyone to compromise, And the Indonesians developed this concept of what you call musyawarah and mufakat, which means consultation and consensus, right? And so that somehow rather, I don't know how, got planted into the DNA of ASEAN from a very early time. And because of that DNA of consultation and consensus, where everybody compromises, then you end up with a result whereby ASEAN has become so peaceful. And what's interesting, by the way, the other miracle of ASEAN that many people don't seem to realize, in many other regions, when two countries have been at war with each other, and when the war ends, the bitterness continues. And they don't talk to each other. They don't come together. See, by contrast, in ASEAN, I used to fight the Vietnamese ambassador for a long time in the UN in the 1980s. But when the Cold War ended, ASEAN admitted Vietnam into ASEAN. And that's amazing, a former adversary. And what's even more remarkable is that in October next month, Timor-Leste will be admitted to ASEAN. Now, why is the admission significant? Timor-Leste, as you know, used to be part of Indonesia and then became independent. It's in some ways similar to a region called Kosovo that used to be part of Serbia and then it's separated, right? And today, relations between Kosovo and Serbia are really bad. They don't talk to each other. And there's no way they can have normal relations with each other, right? That's a normal situation. And guess what? Even though Timor-Leste's separation from Indonesia was a painful thing for Indonesia, Indonesia is sponsoring Timor-Leste to join ASEAN. Now, I can tell you this, you don't even notice it, right? But this is inconceivable in any other region, right? And in some ways it's similar to India and Pakistan, separating from each other. And today India and Pakistan can barely talk to each other. Serbia and Kosovo can't talk to each other, right? Yeah, but here adversaries are supporting each other. I hope you realize by now that this is really an unusual state of affairs. And my big worry, by the way, the reason I talk about it is that because it is so unusual, the big danger is that we take it for granted. We take it like this is normal. It's not normal. It requires a lot of work, a lot of effort, and a lot of commitment to try and keep ASEAN remain peaceful. And that's why, I wanted to come and have this dialogue, because if we don't appreciate what we have today, which is a very special and very unusual, peaceful situation in this region, you can lose it. And so that's why I think we must all become more conscious of this special nature of ASEAN. So I hope I've given enough thoughts for you to.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Kishore. I mean, I think what you've put on the table is something critical for us to think about when we think about regionalism. And, you know, ever since you recently worked on the book, Can Asians Think of Peace? And I noticed when you were traveling, the book, and you mentioned it in the book, in your essay in the book, this concept of geopolitical competence. And you were just saying this in the sense that Southeast Asian regionalism, ASEAN evidences geopolitical competence, war reflects geopolitical incompetence, but ASEAN not having had a war reflects geopolitical competence. I was wondering, you know, this idea is so important. If you could flesh it out a little bit more for us, what are there specific cultural values to geopolitical competence?
Well, it's easier to spot geopolitical incompetence than to spot geopolitical competence, you know. And of course, you know, whenever there's geopolitical incompetence, there is wars, you know. And I believe that every war we see today reflects geopolitical incompetence. So, for example, the war in Ukraine could have been avoided if the EU had made some effort to understand Russia, understand the concerns of Russia, and work with Russia, even though Russia is very different. And frankly, the war in Gaza could have been avoided if the West had made a bigger effort to try and bring a two-state solution to the Middle East and give the Palestinians a homeland. If the Palestinians have a homeland, there's no reason for them to have a war. So again, that's a result of geopolitical incompetence. But if you want an example of geopolitical competence, this is a true story I'm going to tell. And it's a bit sad that many Singaporeans are not aware of something brilliant that was done by some of our founding leaders. And I can tell you that, you know, as you all know this story, soon after Singapore became independent, there was as you know, there was a bombing in Singapore of McDonald House, as you know, by 2 Indonesian Marines. And when the Marines were caught, Singapore put them on trial and Singapore hanged them. Now, this made the leader of Indonesia incredibly angry, President Suharto, because he was also a general and he didn't want to see his soldiers being hanged in Singapore. And when Singapore refused to listen to Indonesia, we hanged the Marines, the Singapore embassy was burnt, and things could have spiraled downwards between Indonesia and Singapore, right? The natural situation after that happens when a small country like Singapore snubs the leader of a big country like Indonesia, the relations went down. So what happened? How did things turn around? And here it's a combination of factors. Number one, we actually had a brilliant Singapore ambassador in Indonesia. His name was Lee Kuan Yew. He's a former minister of state. And he understood that you have to find a way of assuaging the concerns of the Indonesians. So he recommended to Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew that Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew should go to the graves of the 2 Indonesian Marines and sprinkle some flowers, right? Now, in some ways, that could have been seen as a humiliating gesture on the part of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. But he heeded the advice of Ambassador Lee Kuan Yew, went there, sprinkled the flowers. And just a simple act of sprinkling the flowers, in a sense, closed the chapter on a bitter thing. But the story doesn't end there. What's remarkable is that, you know, and I was present at some of these meetings, President Suharto is not a traditional Western-educated person. In fact, President Suharto was a very traditional Javanese mind. And his mind was full of Javanese mysticism. And he didn't understand the legalistic Anglo-Saxon world. Now, Lee Kuan Yew's mind was completely Anglo-Saxon legal mind, right? Everything clear, straightforward, you know, these are the rules, these are the lines. So there should have been no meeting of minds between Lee Kuan Yew and Suharto at all. But amazingly, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew decided that he had to understand the mind of President Suharto. So not only, so he began to immerse himself in Bahasa Indonesia, and I was told he would spend hours listening to speeches of President Suharto in Bahasa to try and understand how he used his language and his mind and all that. And then so when he spoke to President Suharto, he could use the language and concepts that President Suharto had used in his speeches already. Now, believe me, this takes hours and hours and hours of work. But Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was determined to do it. And I can tell you, it was this very unusual friendship that developed within two minds of two completely different cultural universes that enable ASEAN to come together, because by far the two strongest leaders at that time on Southeast Asia were President Suharto of Indonesia and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. So when the two leaders came together, it provided the bridge for ASEAN. Again, this is a story that almost nobody knows, you know. But this is, and can you imagine if the European leaders had done the same thing, had immersed themselves in Russian, listened to hours and hours of the speeches of Putin to understand the mindset of the man and why he thinks Ukraine is so important to the future of Russia. And you know, many people rubbish Putin's views. You can't. His views do matter. But the fact that the Europeans have made no effort whatsoever is actually quite shocking. But it reflected, by the way, and this is where the larger historical context matters a lot. It reflects at that time, at the end of the Cold War, the Europeans thought they had won the Cold War, so they became very arrogant. They saw no reason for compromise with anybody. We have won, we are the top dogs. We decide, you accept what we are today. And that arrogance clearly leads to geopolitical incompetence. Whereas humility, by the way, is a very good quality to have in geopolitics. And that's what this region had. So that's the contrast between what's so special about Southeast Asia and other regions.
我们刚刚听完的就是一场关于和平是如何炼成的地缘政治大师课。马凯硕先生没有使用任何华丽的辞藻，而是用最扎实的区域对比和最生动的历史故事，为我们揭示了东盟奇迹背后的秘密。他为我们清晰地指出了几个核心要点。第一，东盟的和平是一个反常识的奇迹，在一个本应因其极致多样性而战乱不断的地区，却实现了长久的和平，这本身就颠覆了所有西方的地缘政治理论。第二，东盟的成功源于其独特的东方智慧。无论是印尼作为最大国家却选择不主导的谦卑，还是将昔日宿敌如越南、东帝汶化为伙伴的胸怀，都体现了一种与西方零和博弈完全不同的思维方式。第三，真正的地缘政治能力体现在谦卑而非傲慢。他用李光耀花费数小时学习印尼语，理解苏哈托思想的感人故事，与欧洲因冷战胜利后的傲慢而对俄罗斯产生误判，最终导致战争的失败案例，形成了极其鲜明的对比。这场对话也确实留给我们一些值得思考的问题。马凯硕所揭示的欧洲因傲慢而导致的地缘政治无能，是否就是今天西方世界陷入一系列内政外交困境的根本原因？东盟所奉行的那种协商共识、不强加于人的模式，对于一个正在走向多极化的世界，是否提供了一种比西方的对抗模式更具建设性的未来可能？以及我们又该如何理解一个曾被西方定义为火药桶的地区，最终却实现了和平，而一个自诩为文明中心的欧洲，却始终无法摆脱战争的幽灵？如果你认为这期节目对你有价值，请点赞、评论、分享、订阅我们的频道。感谢你的观看。